I want her paycheck sent to my account from now on, you old pig. Those words hung in the air like poison gas. Renee stood there in Mabel's living room, hands on her hips, her face twisted into something between a smile and a sneer. She'd said it loud. She'd said it mean. And she'd said it knowing Lorenzo was standing right behind her, watching it all go down. Mabel felt something inside her crack. Not break. Crack. Like old ice in spring, brittle, ready to give way at any moment. Her hands started to shake. 72 years old, and in that single moment, everything she'd built, everything she'd protected, everything she'd kept sacred felt like it was crumbling in real time. The paycheck. Her paycheck from the library, $340 a week, the only money that was truly hers. The only thing nobody could take. She looked at her son. Lorenzo.
Her boy.
The one she'd raised, fed, put through night school while working double shifts. His eyes were on the floor, not meeting hers. His jaw tight. His shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller, trying to disappear into the walls. Behind Renee stood her daughter-in-law, that woman who'd walked into their lives 2 years ago like she owned the place. And now she was standing here, demanding Mabel's last thread of independence, like it was nothing. But this wasn't the first time. Oh no. This was the moment everything finally boiled over. Months of it. Months of small cuts, tiny humiliations, quiet invasions into every corner of Mabel's life. Mabel had swallowed it all. She'd smiled through it. She'd tried to keep the peace for Lorenzo's sake. She'd told herself that patience was a virtue, that suffering in silence was nobility. But standing in her own living room, being called a pig by a woman who'd never worked a day in her life, watching her own son refuse to look at her, something shifted. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. Mabel's trembling hand slowly steadied. Her shoulders went back. And when her eyes met Renee's face again, something inside Mabel had switched off. Or maybe it had switched on.
She didn't speak. She didn't yell.
She didn't cry. She just stood there, watching Renee, and for the first time in months, Mabel Thorne wasn't afraid anymore. She was something else entirely. Would you let anyone talk to your mother like that? Don't forget to hit like if you'd stand up for her. Keep watching. What Mabel did next will make your jaw drop. Because that was the moment she stopped being their victim. That was the moment everything changed. Before Renee, there was Armand. 72 years sounds old when you say it out loud, but for Mabel it didn't feel like a number, it felt like a whole lifetime of being someone. Being needed. Being loved. Being seen. She'd spent 43 years with her husband. He was an engineer. Not famous, not rich, but brilliant in the quiet way that mattered. He'd fix things. He'd listen. He'd look at her like she was the most interesting person in every room, even when they were just sitting on the porch in their old house, not talking at all. When Armand died 5 years ago, something in Mabel had frozen. Not shattered. Frozen. Like she'd been put in suspension, just going through the motions. She'd kept working at the library. 67 years old, and still shelving books, helping people find what they needed. It gave her structure. Purpose. The paycheck, small as it was, meant independence. It meant she didn't have to ask Lorenzo for anything. It meant dignity.
Armand had always told her that.
She could still hear his voice like it was yesterday. Never let anyone count your worth in dollars, Mabel. Your value isn't in a bank account. It's in here. He'd put his hand on her heart. The library had been her sanctuary after he died. The smell of old paper, the quiet hum of people learning things, discovering worlds they'd never seen before. It soothed something in her. And then Lorenzo got married. At first, Renee seemed fine. Helpful, even. She'd call the house offering to bring groceries. She'd show up with a smile, saying she wanted to help with the bills. Mabel had thought, thank God. He finally found someone. But nice doesn't always stay nice. Helpful doesn't always stay helpful. Within months, Renee was rearranging Mabel's kitchen without asking. She was intercepting mail. She was moving things, Mabel's reading glasses, her photographs, her personal letters, and whenever Mabel asked where they were, Renee would say, "Oh, I was just organizing. Doesn't it look better?"
No.
It didn't. It looked like someone else's house. Can you already feel something's off with Renee? A comment yes if you sense it too. What Mabel didn't know then was that Renee had already decided something about her. One night, Mabel was in her bedroom and heard Renee on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was low, snake-like. "That old wait is going to be a problem. We need her out or her money out. I don't care which." Mabel's hand flew to her mouth. The phone line went dead quiet in her ears. She stood there in the darkness of her bedroom, and that's when she understood. This wasn't just unkindness. This was a plan. That was the moment Mabel realized that endurance wasn't dignity, it was complicity. The first time Renee stole from her, Mabel almost didn't notice.
It was a Tuesday.
Her paycheck had been deposited, and Mabel was planning to pay her portion of utilities like she always did. She kept her financial life simple. Direct deposit every other Friday. Cash withdrawal every Sunday at the bank. Small amounts, nothing fancy. But this Tuesday, her envelope was light. $20 light. She went to the bank and asked to see her statements. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, pulled up the account and frowned. There was a withdrawal that hadn't been made by Mabel. Not the withdrawal itself. Renee had somehow gotten into the account and taken money out. When confronted, Renee laughed it off. Said she was helping pay for groceries. Said Lorenzo must have given her permission. Lorenzo said nothing. Just looked away like a coward. That's when Mabel changed. Not overnight. In small ways. She started writing things down.
Dates. Times.
What was taken. How much. A memo pad hidden inside her nightstand. Then a shoebox. Then documents. She was building something invisible. A wall of proof that nobody could argue with. Renee demanded Mabel redirect her paycheck to a joint account. Said it would be easier. Said it would help with expenses. Mabel smiled sweetly and said she'd think about it.
But she didn't think about it.
She changed her direct deposit instead. She opened a new account at a different bank, one that Renee didn't know about. She started moving money there, every penny. Renee would never see it coming. What would you do if your daughter-in-law stole from you? Let me know in the comments. The stealing got bolder. A check here. A small transfer there. And Mabel documented every single one. She wasn't angry yet. Anger was a luxury for people who had time to waste. Mabel had something better. She had a plan that was growing teeth in the dark. When Renee finally demanded the paycheck be redirected, Mabel's eyes went sharp and cold. Her voice stayed calm, but her mind was already 3 moves ahead. This woman had made a terrible mistake thinking Mabel was weak, because she was old. Because she was quiet. Mabel was building something that Renee couldn't see coming. Inside a worn brown shoebox under Mabel's bed sat 30 years of her life. Old bank statements. Letters from Armand written on yellow legal pad paper. Pictures of Lorenzo as a boy. Medical records. Insurance documents. And most importantly, a ledger. Handwritten. Dated entries. Everything Renee had taken. Everything she'd manipulated. Everything she'd lied about. Mabel opened that box on a Wednesday afternoon, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself feel the full weight of what had been happening. She picked up her phone and called a lawyer named Mr. Vance. She'd met him once at a community event years ago. He had kind eyes and a reputation for fighting for people who'd been wronged. When she walked into his office, the first thing he said was, "You've brought documents." She had 3 folders. He looked through them slowly, and when he was done, he leaned back in his chair. "Once she learns she's locked out, she'll strike harder," he warned. His voice was steady but serious. "She knows you know now. People like this, they either back down or they go nuclear. You need to be ready." Mabel was ready. She'd been getting ready without even knowing it. Mr. Vance helped her establish a trust. She named her granddaughter Etta as the primary beneficiary. She safeguarded her estate. She changed passwords. She moved documents to a safety deposit box. She did everything she could to make sure that when this fell apart, and it would fall apart, Renee wouldn't be able to grab anything. Wouldn't be able to rewrite history. If you believe preparation is power, tap the like button. On a Thursday morning, Mabel sat in Mr. Vance's office and signed everything. The documents made a soft sound as she signed them, one after another. With each signature, she felt lighter, like she was finally taking her power back. Like she was saying to everyone who'd ever doubted her, ever underestimated her, ever thought she was just a tired old woman who would roll over and take it, no. Not this time. She went home to an empty house. Renee was out. Lorenzo was at work. And Mabel sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and waited. She didn't know exactly when Renee would figure out what had happened. But she knew it would be soon. And when it was, everything would change. Renee was smiling, but her smile had teeth now. Actual teeth. The kind of smile that people use when they're planning something you won't see coming. She'd started it 3 weeks after Mabel had changed her passwords. 3 weeks after the legal documents had been filed. 3 weeks of Renee growing angrier and colder and more desperate. She started telling people that Mabel was losing her mind, that she was forgetful, that she was becoming senile. One of the neighbors mentioned it to Mabel at the grocery store. "I heard you forgot your own address last week. That must be so scary." Mabel had never forgotten her address in her life. But the lie was already spreading like a virus. It infected every conversation. It made people doubt what they saw. It made them question Mabel's version of reality. The strength of being underestimated is that nobody sees you coming. Mabel started recording conversations. She'd looked up the law. In her state, one-party consent recording was legal. She could record conversations as long as she was part of them.
So she did.
She got out her old digital recorder, the one she'd used to document audiobooks at the library, and she wore it under her sweater. When Renee would come home angry, when she'd snap at Mabel or make threats, when she'd whisper on the phone about Mabel's supposed mental decline, it was all being captured. Every word, every lie. One afternoon, Mabel was in the kitchen making soup. Renee came home and found her there, and something about that moment made Renee careless. Or maybe desperate. She demanded that Mabel sign a power of attorney form. Said it would make things easier if anything happened to her. Mabel looked at the document. It gave Renee control of everything. Her accounts, her medical decisions, her house, her entire life. She picked up a pen and pretended to sign it. But she didn't. She just moved the pen across the paper in a way that looked like a signature. Then she handed it back to Renee with a smile.
Sweet.
Gentle. Forgiving. The kind of smile that an old woman gives when she's agreed to something. Renee took the document and left the room. That's when Mabel's hand started shaking. Because she'd caught Renee doing something else. While Mabel was supposedly signing the power of attorney, Renee had quickly forged Mabel's actual signature on another form. She traced it from an old document. It was almost perfect. Almost. But Mabel had seen it. Mabel had evidence of it. And now it was in her shoebox, right next to everything else. Ever been called crazy just for standing your ground? You'll relate to Mabel here. Mabel put the recording device in her nightstand and sat on her bed in the dark. Tomorrow she would call Mr. Vance. Tomorrow she would show him the forged form. Tomorrow, everything would move into a new phase. But tonight, she just sat there understanding something that changed everything. This wasn't about getting her paycheck back. This wasn't about being treated with respect. This was about proving that you can't just steal someone's life and expect them to let you keep it. Renee had made a calculation. She decided that Mabel was weak. That an old woman wouldn't fight back. That she could just take until there was nothing left but an empty shell shuffling around in a house that wasn't hers anymore. What Renee didn't know was that she'd awakened something in Mabel that nobody had seen in decades. And that something was about to burn everything down. Mabel invited them to sit down for coffee on a Friday morning.
Just coffee.
Just 3 people around a table. Nothing special. That's what she told them. What she didn't tell them was that she'd spent the night arranging documents. That every piece of evidence was organized in a folder on her lap. That her heart was beating so hard she thought they might hear it. Lorenzo came first. Then Renee. They sat at the kitchen table where they'd shared hundreds of meals, hundreds of moments that had slowly turned into something toxic. Mabel poured the coffee with steady hands. She'd practiced this moment 1,000 times in her head. Not yelling, not crying, just facts. Just truth laid out like cards on a table. She opened the folder and slid the bank statements across first. The ones showing unauthorized withdrawals. Then the receipts. Then the forged power of attorney documents. Renee's face changed colors, went pale, then red, then something in between that looked like panic. Lorenzo stared at the documents like they were written in a language he didn't understand. "This is ridiculous," Renee said. But her voice had lost its edge. "You can't prove anything." Mabel pressed play on her recorder. The sound of Renee's voice filled the kitchen. Every threat, every lie about Mabel losing her mind, every conversation about getting her money out, every manipulation caught on a digital recording, so clear that even Lorenzo couldn't deny it. Renee's coffee cup fell from her hands and shattered on the tile floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. Would you have done the same in her place? Type justice in the chat if you agree. "I'm giving you two choices," Mabel said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of everything. 5 years of grief, months of betrayal, decades of self-respect. "You can settle with me and my lawyer, or we go to court. You can either do this quietly, or you can let the whole world see what you've done, what you've both allowed to happen." She looked at Lorenzo when she said the second part. Her own son. And she saw something break in him. Finally. Too late, but finally. Renee stood up so fast her chair fell backward. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but there was nothing left to say. Everything had already been said into that recorder. Everything had already been written down in that shoebox. Mabel had built something so solid that lies couldn't touch it. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and fear. Judge Brennan was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that had seen every lie a person could tell. She looked at Renee like she was looking at something she'd scraped off her shoe. Renee rejected the settlement. Out of pride or stupidity or some combination of both, she decided court was the place to fight. She thought a judge would see things her way. She thought she could charm her way through. She was wrong about everything. The evidence came out like an avalanche. The unauthorized withdrawals, the forged documents, the recordings. The pattern of manipulation and theft stretched back so far that it couldn't be explained away as a simple misunderstanding. Renee's lawyer tried to paint Mabel as confused, as emotionally unstable, as someone whose memory couldn't be trusted. But Judge Brennan wasn't buying it. She looked at the recordings. She read through the documents with her glasses on. She listened to testimony from the bank teller, from Mr. Vance, from Mabel herself speaking so calmly and clearly that every word landed like a hammer. Then she looked at Lorenzo when he finally admitted the truth. That he knew something was wrong. That he'd been too weak to stop it. That he'd chosen his wife over his mother and regretted it every single day. Here comes the moment we've all been waiting for. Don't scroll now. Judge Brennan's verdict came down like justice itself had finally found solid ground. Renee was found guilty of theft, fraud, and attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person. The judgment was significant. Restitution with interest. All the money returned. Renee was ordered to vacate the premises within 30 days. She was to have no contact with Mabel without legal representation present. And there was something else. Something that made Renee's face go completely blank. The judge turned to Mabel and said, "Your quiet strength is a lesson to everyone in this courtroom. You didn't scream. You didn't fall apart. You documented. You organized. You fought. And you won." Mabel's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of anyone. The quiet strength humbled Renee more than any outburst ever could. It showed everyone that dignity wasn't in rage. It was in knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take it. Renee moved out on a Tuesday. She took boxes and bags and left the house looking smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer together now that her poison wasn't spreading through every room. Lorenzo helped her load the truck, and Mabel watched from the window but didn't say anything. 3 days later, Lorenzo came back. He stood at the door like a stranger, which is what he'd become. His face was swollen from crying. He begged forgiveness. Said he'd been weak. Said he knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he wanted to try. He wanted his mother back. Mabel let him in. They sat in the same kitchen where everything had fallen apart, and this time she made the coffee because she wanted to, not because she was serving anyone. A week later, Mabel did something that shocked Lorenzo so much he nearly fell over. She went to see Renee. Found her in a small apartment across town, living alone, broken down in a way that only a person who'd lost everything understands. Mabel knocked on the door, and when Renee opened it, she didn't slam it in Mabel's face. She just stared. Mabel had brought groceries. Real food. Chicken. Vegetables.
Bread.
Nothing fancy. Nothing that said forgiveness. Just food for a human being who was hungry. She didn't say much while she was there. She helped put things away. She looked at the empty walls and the bare refrigerator and the sadness that hung over everything like a blanket. When she was leaving, Renee whispered, "Why are you helping me after everything I did?" Mabel paused at the door. She didn't turn around at first. When she did, her face was sad but not angry. "Because hate makes me smaller," she said. "And I'm done being small." Would you have forgiven her? Comment yes or no. The scholarship ceremony took place on a spring afternoon at the local library. The same library where Mabel had worked for all those years. Where she'd shelved books and helped people and kept herself intact through everything. The room was full. There were maybe 200 people there. Community leaders.
Teachers.
Local news. And in the middle of it all stood a foundation that didn't exist 6 months ago. The Mabel Thorne Scholarship Fund. Money that came from restitution. Money that came from quiet justice. Money that was being used to help women rebuild their lives. Single mothers. Women leaving abuse. Women who'd lost everything and needed help getting back on their feet. The first scholarship was going to her granddaughter Etta, but it wouldn't be the last. Etta stepped up to the podium. 20 years old, brilliant, and completely unaware of how much her grandmother had fought to make this moment possible. She talked about resilience, about the strength of the women in her family, about never giving up. Mabel sat in the front row with tears finally falling, and she didn't try to stop them. If you believe good deeds can turn pain into purpose, hit the like button right now. Then something unexpected happened. Renee appeared in the audience. She was sitting in the back, tears streaming down her face, watching the ceremony. When Mabel saw her, she didn't look away. She just looked at her with something that was almost compassion. Almost. Not quite. But close. After the ceremony ended and people were mingling, Renee approached Mabel. She was carrying a box. Inside the box were fresh pastries. Homemade. The kind Mabel used to make decades ago, when she was happy. When the world was still kind. "I made these," Renee said. "I've been thinking about what you said. About hate making you smaller. I've been very small for a very long time." She held out the box with shaking hands. Mabel took it. She didn't hug Renee. But she didn't close the door either. Lorenzo became part of his mother's cause. He volunteered. He helped with applications. He helped women fill out forms and understand their rights. He became the man he should have been all along. Not through force. Through understanding what his weakness had cost. Mabel sits in her garden now on quiet mornings. The same garden where she used to sit with Armand 50 years ago. The same garden that had watched her break and then rebuild herself. The roses are blooming. The birds are singing. And Mabel is finally at peace. A letter came last month. It was from a woman in another state. She'd heard about the Mabel Thorne Scholarship Fund. She'd applied and gotten accepted. She was going back to school. She was rebuilding her life. And she wanted to say thank you. There's been a dozen letters like that. A dozen women who took the money that came from pain and turned it into purpose. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories of quiet strength and karma. Mabel understands something now that she didn't understand before. Revenge isn't about hurting people back. It's not about winning. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about standing up and saying, "I will not let you define me. I will not let you take this. I will take what you broke, and I will rebuild it into something beautiful. Renee is gone from their lives, but not completely. She sends letters sometimes. Apologies that are real now.
Not forced. Real.
Mabel reads them but doesn't respond. Some doors don't need to open again. Some people don't deserve that. But the fact that she could forgive Renee, not for Renee's sake but for her own, that changed everything. The final letter in Mabel's collection came from a judge. Not the one from the trial. A different one. A federal judge who'd heard about the Mabel Thorne Scholarship Fund. The letter said that the foundation's work had inspired a national grant. More money. More opportunities. More women getting the chance that Mabel had fought so hard to keep. The grant was being named after her. Officially. Legally. Forever. Mabel held the letter and remembered standing in her living room while her daughter-in-law spat cruelty at her. She remembered thinking her life was over. She remembered the moment when something switched inside her. The moment she stopped being a victim. But most of all, she remembered Armin's voice. Never let anyone count your worth in dollars. She hadn't. And that made all the difference. She said, I want your paycheck sent to my account. What she didn't know was that I'd already invested it. In my freedom, in my legacy, and in justice that whispers louder than revenge. This is exactly what quiet strength looks like. This is what happens when an old woman refuses to break. Don't miss the next story on this channel. Subscribe now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story of support, love, and the strength that comes from standing up for yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you would have done. Inspire others with your wisdom. Because these stories matter. Your voice matters. And the world needs to know that it's never too late to fight for your dignity.